Namaste and welcome everyone to Atharva Forum for this talk on Swami Karpatri-ji's Ramayana Mimamsa. Before I begin, let me give a very brief introduction to Swami Karpatri-ji. Karpatri-ji was a sannyasi in the Hindu Dashnami monastic tradition. Um, he was born in 1907 and he attained Brahmalina Avastha in 1982. He was hailed as a Dharma Samrat in his times by various religious and spiritual leaders. And Karpatri-ji has done a lot of work both in as a author, as a scholar, as a religious leader, and as a spiritual leader. Karpatriji has left a huge corpus of work for us for our times, and his life is exemplary of the scholarship of our Dharmagurus and the fortitude of the Sanatan Guru Parampara of this land. Karpatriji established various institutions like the Dharma Sangh for Dharma Prachar. He also started this party, a political party called Akhil Bharatiya Ram Rajya Parishad, which was a traditionalist party that was electorally active in the 1950s. He wrote a slew of books. Some of the more popular ones are Marxwad or Ram Raja, which can be treated as a Poorvapaksha or a treatise on Marxwad and on Western philosophy as a whole from a traditionalist lens. He wrote another book called Ramayana Mimamsa, which will be the subject of the talk today, which is a treatise again on the Western gaze on Ramayana and how to understand various renditions of Ramayana from a traditionalist lens. Another book of Karpatri-ji Maharaj is the Vedanta Parijata, which is a treatise on Vedas. There is a book called Bhakti Sudha, there is a book called Bhagavad Sudha, Radha Sudha, Vichar Piyush, so on. He has written on a wide variety of topics, and it is really beyond the scope of this talk to give even a very brief introduction of all these works. It's a work spanning quite a few decades and rich scholarship. He was also the founder of a journal or magazine called Sanmark, and the current Shankaracharyas of the Dwarka Mutt and the Puri Govardhan Mutt, they are direct disciples of Karpatriji Maharaj. So his works really are the guiding light for people of today who are trying to understand more and more of who they are, what their tradition is, and what Sanatan Dharma is. It is in this context that today, through this talk, I would like to throw some light on this book called Ramayana Mimamsa. Now, Ramayana Mimamsa, as I mentioned, can be treated as a Purvapaksha of sorts of the missionary gaze or the colonial gaze or the Indologist version of looking at Ramayana. It can also be seen as a Mimansa on what Ramayana means to us in the light of various confusions and predicaments which are all around us. Now, a lot of these are as much valid for our times today as they were valid for Swami Karpatriji's times then. It's also not a hyperbole to say that we are perhaps in a bit more of a difficult state now, because at least then we had somebody like Karpatri-ji Maharaj to refute a lot of these allegations and a lot of these distortions. Today, we do not even have that kind of a traditionalist scholarship available in huge numbers, considering the fact that the number of people who are spewing such distortions on our own epics have really increased more and more compared to those times too now. Now, in this particular book on Ramayana Mimamsa, a lot of focus is on the work of Camil Bulcke, who was a missionary, a Belgian Jesuit missionary, who was known for his work on Ram Katha. So he wrote a thesis and submitted in about 1949. It was published as a book called Ram Katha Ki Utpatti or Vikas, which is really the genesis and development of Ram Katha. So this is primarily Camille Bulcke's vision of looking at how Ramayana has evolved or how Ramayana has come to be, and he comes up with various theories, primarily from a missionary gaze or a colonial gaze, trying to put a lot of dating around when Rama became a god and how Ramayana of today came to be, and how there were a multiplicity of Ramakatha traditions, so on. So what Karpatriji does in this book really is to take out each one of those arguments that Camille Bulcke comes up in terms of Ram Katha ki Utpatti or Vikas, and then gives a rebuttal and does a dissection of sorts from a Sanatan Vedic dharmic perspective to help us understand how to really understand Camille Bulcke or even various Indologist analysis of Ramayana. Now, the fact that we had Dharmagurus of our own who did solid Poorvapaksha doesn't get enough attention today in our times. So there are today, when we look at our own Dharmagurus, we tend to think them as perhaps people who are into spiritual pursuits, who are into puja parts or pravachans, so on. But the fact that we did have somebody like Swami Karpatri-ji, who not only was well equipped to do a Purvapaksha and give a rebuttal to all of these kind of distortions, but he actually took the effort to take out time and then read each one of these works, dissect them, and then publish something which is can be considered very, very scholarly and very, very academic in nature, in terms of trying to give a traditional perspective on these matters. So this book is really important in that context, because as I mentioned early on, these forces continue to stay at work even today. There are a bunch of narratives at play on our own Indian classics and Indian traditional sources. So it is, the onus is really on us to read these works like Karpatri-ji Maharaj's Ramayana Mimamsa, and then respond to new but similar challenges that are posed by such counter narratives that are today running. In the name of academic freedom and in the name of various other such terms, you do see a lot of inheritors of Camil Bulcke's kind of thinking, that there are still a bunch of people who throw all sort of aspersions on our own epics. And it is in this context, through this talk, that I would like to emphasize that we do have traditional scholarship available on these matters, and we should definitely take a lot of inspiration from their methods and how that whole dissection was done. Now, coming to the problems with the Western gaze in terms of how they look at our own epics, Puranas, and Vedas, here's what Karpatri-ji Maharaj starts with in terms of his own analysis of not just Camil Bulcke's Ramkatha, but also in terms of the Western authors, Indologists, historical method, so on. So he says that a lot of Western scholars, particularly those who are belonging to the Abrahamic faith, like Christianity, Judaism, or Islam for that matter, they have trouble understanding this idea of an Avataravaad, which is this cycle of avatars, which is something that an astic Hindu, a believer Hindu, uh, uh, is ready to embrace very easily, but an academic or somebody who is wedded to the historic method will have a lot of trouble understanding the Avatarvad. And that is particularly more acute in the case of scholars who are wedded to the Abrahamic faiths, because if you look at Christianity or Islam or Judaism, they are faiths that are built around this idea of a single lifetime, followed by a judgment day, and then followed by eternal damnation in hell or eternal glory in heaven. This is an idea that runs quite contrary to the Hindu dharmic faith, which looks at the idea of jiva, which looks at the idea of Ishvara, the Punarjanma parampara. These are all ideas that run very contrary to this idea of the Abrahamic faiths. And the belief system of the person who is trying to analyze some of our epics will definitely play a role in their ability to interpret or understand some of the propositions which are embedded within our own epics, Puranas, and Vedas and Shastras, so on. So, for example, Karpatriji Maharaj emphatically states that the idea of a Nirgun Brahma, the idea of a moksha, doesn't exist in these faiths. And their idea of a jiva is very different from ours. And our idea of Ishvara is very different from theirs. And our idea of Ishvara's avatars is, of course, very different from whatever similar conception they may have in some form. Not just this, even if you look at, let's say, something like the Christian story of creation, there is a biblical narrative which says that the creation happened in so and so date. For example, there's a lot of theories around 4004 BC being the date when the Christian theory of creation uh, starts. So a lot of the scholarship of that era, particularly of the early 19th and early 18th and 20th century eras, was driven by a lot of these the missionary agenda and a lot of these Indology scholars who tried to force fit a lot of these dates into whatever other cultures sources that they were trying to interpret. So particularly in the case of Vedas, you would see this happen where they were trying to force fit Vedas into a certain date, so that it doesn't predate their date of creation. Now, Karpatriji Maharaj talks about this, that the fact that they have their own dates of creation and their own biblical myths around it, that does play a role when they try to analyze our own sources. Of course, I mean, these are dates that perhaps today the modern scientific view might differ from, and there might be battles going on in their own front on that. That's immaterial for us, perhaps. But what is more important for us is that a lot of these scholars who try to narrate our own stories in their terms were really narrating it in their own worldviews, primarily in a biblical narrative. It is also interesting that these days there is also some talk of history without chronology, and perhaps that is something that Karpatri-ji Maharaj also is alluding to in some of his works here. That a lot of these scholars are also wedded to this ideology of dating or putting everything in a chronology, and that is not something that traditional Hindu perspective of looking at this really was all about. Now, a lot of Western scholars also tend to dismiss our stories of creation as seen in the Vedas, in Ramayana, in Mahabharata, and Puranas based on evolutionary theories. For example, that scholars of that era used to insist that life started with amoeba or hydra, and then a man evolved from ape, and he was a hunter gatherer, and then he became civilized eventually. And of course, that gives a segue into saying that the ancestors of India were Aryans who came from outside India, and then they had to civilize the people in here. These were the ideas that were very predominant in that era. In fact, they're still predominant. Let's say if you go to a place like Wikipedia or some of the books of history in our own curriculum today. Now, Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that if you look at the timeline of these ideas, they are perhaps just about 200 years old or 250 years old, but the stronghold of these ideas is that they continue to dominate a lot of the narratives today in our own sense when we talk about our own history. So if you look at the traditional conception of time or traditional conception of Vedas, which Karpatri-ji Maharaj continues to emphasize all through his works, and particularly so in this book, we look at Vedas as anadi, which is something which is beginningless. And these scholars come back and say that it is wrong. They say that it is incorrect. They say that what you think is Vedas are really, there were songs or hymns that were being sung by some Aryans, and these were conjured after a certain BC. Some say 3000 BC, and some say 1500 BC, some say 1200 BC, whatever the date may be. And then they come back to say that the Rig Veda came first, then came the Yajurveda, then came the Samaveda, and Atharva Veda. There's a dispute. They say that it's perhaps an inferior Veda, or maybe it was added much later. And then they also say this, that what you call as Brahmanas in the Vedas, they perhaps were not really a part of Vedas, and Upanishads were maybe a much later additions written by Kshatriyas. So these are the ideas that continue to dominate our discourse. As I mentioned, if you go to Wikipedia today and start reading the entry on Vedas, you'd find all of this. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj starts in his book. He talks a lot about this of how the Westerners looked at our own Vedic chronology, our own evolutionary theories, and on Vedas, on Bharata, on Puranas and Ramayana, so on. And he also talks about. Not just these timelines. He says that the Westerners also went one line further to say that the Brahmins of the Vedic era were doing some kind of rituals and yajnas. They were primarily polytheists. They didn't have this idea of Ekeshwarvada, or a loose translation can be monotheism. And they say that this idea of a Nirgun Nirakan Brahma was added much later. Originally, they were just like nature worshippers, forest dwellers, and they were doing this out of fear of nature. And then slowly they invented this idea of Devis and Devatas, and then just added them later to their own epics and to the Vedas. And they say that this is how it evolved. So they look at this whole thing as in a kind of evolutionary trajectory of starting from somewhere, discovering something, doing an addition here, doing an addition there, so on. So Karpatri-ji talks about a lot of these narratives in this book, and he says that these are the narratives which are really distorting our own perception of ourselves. And a lot of this, of course, has also been discussed at length in Karpatri-ji's own classic works like Marchwad or Ramraja, or Ved Ka Swarup or Pramanya. There are other books like this as well. So while in this book, in the context of Bulcke's uh, distortions, he does pick a lot of arguments from there. Now, one of the things that Bulcke does in his analysis on Ram Katha is also this obsession with dating and chronology, as I mentioned earlier. So, the narrative of not just Bulcke, of a lot of these scholars from the Indological and the Western traditions, they are obsessed with dating, and they say that a lot of the Puranas are compiled after the Gupta era, and they continue to evolve till 16th century. A lot of them don't agree with the fact that the authorship of the Ramayana is with Adikavi Valmiki. They don't agree with Krishna Dvaipayana Vyasa being a contemporary of the Mahabharata times. In fact, there's a lot of dispute around the chronology or the dating of Mahabharata itself amongst all these Western scholars. And somebody like Bulcke, for example, in his work, uh, does in fact says that a lot of the origins of our own stories are really from oral traditions, storytellers. He says Valmiki came much later. He was trying to adapt stories of Ramayana which were prevalent by bards and storytellers of that time. So there are a lot of these theories that the Western scholars have propagated, and in this book Karpatri-ji refutes or does a takedown of each of these allegations. Now, another interesting or a favorite trope of a lot of these Western scholars is to also say that there was a tussle between Brahmanas and Kshatriyas all through our culture. And they also have a lot of fancy theories around the origin of Varna Vyavastha, around the origin of idol worship, around the origin of the sannyasi tradition, so on. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj here says that fundamentally a lot of these people, they believe that Avataravaad is mithya, which is fiction. So they say that the avatars to Vishnu were attributed much later. So Bulke, for example, is a very open in his criticism on the avatars of Matsya Avatar, Kurma Avatar, so on. So he says that these are later day affiliations, and in fact, he goes one step further and says that Rama was perhaps just a human. He was maybe a good king, a good tribal king. Later, he became a god, and later he became a Vishnu avatar. He says the same about Krishna as well, that these were perhaps just human beings who were good, who excelled in being good kings. That was all about it. It was only at a later date that bhakti evolved. It was only at a later date that avatara was ascribed back to them. Now, Swami Karpatri-ji here says that this whole idea of who is who, really, when you look at some of these allegations that somebody like Bulke does, where he says that Matsya Avatar, Kurma Avatar, and Varaha Avatar were originally associated with Prajapati in Vedas, and it was only later that it became ascribed to Vishnu's. So Karpatriji really questions this, that who is Vishnu or who is Prajapati, and how many avatars have they had, and when did it happen? These are not questions that really that can be answered within the purview of what is called the Pratyaksha Praman and the Anuman Praman, which is by doing an analysis based on what you see and what you hear, or based on your sensory evaluations, or based on pure inferences based on rationality. These are really questions that can be answered based on the pramanas which are outside of pratyaksha and outside of anumana, as our traditional scholarships looked at these. So this kind of a pramana based view is really outside of the purview of a lot of our modern historians, because they refuse to look at pramanas that are outside of pratyaksha and outside of anumana. And it is in this context that Karpatriji Maharaj says that you take Ramayana or the Mahabharata or our Puranas, Upapuranas, Dharmashastra, Darshanas. These are all they have all originated from Vedas, and Veda itself is a Swatha Pramana, which is a Pramana on its own. And our own traditional scholarship and commentators have actually figured out a way to do a samanvaya across all these various renditions across our epics and Puranas, our Shastras, so on. So it is not that a method of doing a samanvaya or an integration uh, or an adjustment or an explanation of all of such multitude of sources doesn't exist in our own traditional mold. We need not step out of the traditional mold and try to understand this from a Western gaze to understand all of these sources of our own tradition. So Karpatri Maharaj here also says that Avatarvad is not just a bhavana, it's not just a feeling, and it is not just a it's not a kalpana, which is it's not fiction. So he repeatedly emphasized this because it is very crucial to the project of somebody like Bulke. He was really trying to detach Rama from Vedas, detach Rama from Vishnu and then make him just a human king. So this whole defense of Avatarvad hence becomes fundamentally important for anybody trying to understand all of our epics and Puranas from a traditional standpoint. So, Karpatri-ji Maharaj here emphasizes that just like how you have the sun and the moon, uh, the avatars are also like that. They are param praman bhut satya. So he says that the Avataravad can be traced back again to our like primary sources of the Vedas, and when you look at Vedas as well, he repeatedly emphasizes that you should not look at Prarambha and Ant. So there is no Bhed Bhav in the Vedic discourse on Prarambha and Ant. So we look at it, as I mentioned earlier on, the traditional scholarship looks at Vedas as Anadi and Apaurusheya. So I think this whole idea of looking at such from a Western gaze has become so ingrained in our own um, understanding these days that when we start looking at our own stories, we become skeptics by ourselves. We start trying to date them. We look at origins. We ourselves try to fight over dates. We try to put a BC here, an AD date there, so on. And it is in that context, I think, the traditional critique of Swami Karpatri-ji here in this book becomes very important. So, as I mentioned, he defends the conception of an avatarvad based on a Vedic praman, and he says that the meanings and interpretations of words like Prajapati, Brahma, Vishnu, so on. These are words that need to be explained based on Shastra, and it is only based on the Shastra that you are ascribing a kind of a greatness to the idea of Vishnu. If you take out the Shastras, if you take out the Vedas, there is really nothing, like no Praman based on which any of our avatars or any of our Devas can stand. And it is in this context that he also says that this whole division that the Indologists and scholars try to make between Vedic Dharma and Brahman Dharma and so on, these also are incorrect formulations. Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that there is a certain way of a traditional way of looking at all of these together as a whole, and he repeatedly emphasized that in this particular book. Now, in this book, apart from Camil Bulcke's arguments, Karpatri-ji Maharaj also takes down a lot of arguments from 19th century Indologists like Anthony McDonnell, Hermann Jacobi, Albrecht Weber, so on. So these are Indologists who propagated the view that, let's say, the Rama-Ravana battle is a corollary of Indra-Vritasura battle. These were not gods, and they became gods much later. And they also say that if you look at the traditional view on Ramayana having seven kandas, these scholars say that the Balakanda and Uttarakanda were later added. Particularly the Uttarakanda, they say that they were added by Vandi Magadas, who were professional singers and bards. And they say that over time, a human king or a normal king of the Ayodhya Kanda and Yuddha Kanda was transformed into a god, and he became a avatar of Lord Vishnu. He was perhaps not originally a moral ideal for the people. He later turned into a moral ideal by a specific set of people. So this is typically the Indologist discourse of that era, and a lot of it continues to persist in our era as well. And Karpatri-ji Maharaj takes down each one of these line by line in this book. He also refers to other Indologists like A.B. Keith and Maurice Winternis, so on. And he says that it is on the foundation of all of these indological methods and indological works that somebody like Camil Bulcke has written his book on Ramakatha, where he came up with all sorts of these propositions and more. So when he's rebutting all of these propositions from all of these Western scholars, Karpatri-ji Maharaj again emphasizes the fact that Vedas are Anadi, Apaurusheya, and Nitya. And this whole idea of looking at the mantra part of the Veda, the Brahmana part of the Veda, Upanishad, as different or disconnected or later day additions is wrong. And he says that the traditional view is to look at all of them as an integral whole. And he says that Ramayana, Mahabharata, Puranas, and Agamas, and all other Shastras, a lot of them are seen as a Vyakhyana of Vedas. So these are like extended commentary of what is mentioned in the form of in Vedas, in the form of sutras. So you have a brief mention there, a brief mention here, and a lot of our own epics and Puranas and Shastras need to be seen as an elaboration of what is already present in Vedas, and it is not correct to disconnect them or to say that these are a later day addition. Now, there is a discussion in the book, starting with Camil Bulcke's accusations of the mention of Ikshvaku, Rama, Dasharatha, Sita in the Vedas and the Upanishad. And it is in this context that Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that Ramayana needs to be seen as a Vistrut Vivechan, which is an extended commentary of what is already there in Vedas with respect to the Ramakatha. Now, Karpatri-ji Maharaj again insists that as per the traditional perspective, as per Valmiki Ramayana itself, Valmiki was a contemporary of Rama. So to say that Valmiki came much later, or Valmiki Ramayana came much later, and there was some other version of Ramayana predating Valmiki Ramayana isn't correct when looked at from a traditional perspective. And Karpatri-ji Maharaj says the same even about Krishna Dvaipayan Vyasa, to say that he was indeed a contemporary of the times of Krishna and Mahabharata, and these were Maharshis, and these Maharshis were able to render these narratives to us based on their presence, then, of course, based on their tapobala and based on their Ritambara Pragna. So these are ideas that Western scholars either don't understand or don't want to understand. Uh, in fact, Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that there have been so many traditional commentaries to Ramayana over the years, over centuries, in fact. So a lot of the Western Indological narrative that I just spoke of earlier on, all of this conflicts with all the traditional commentaries that we have had over centuries. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that a lot of these scholars, they do not understand these diversity of commentaries, diversity of renditions. They don't understand how to do the samanvaya, and hence they look at these outward inconsistencies here and there and dismiss everything as a prakshipta, which is a later day addition. In fact, if you look at Camil Bulcke's criticism of Ramakatha or Valmiki Ramayana, every other thing where there is a minor inconsistency, he comes back and says, oh, maybe this was a prakshipt, or maybe this was an addition. So Karpatri-ji says that the fact that the traditional discourse does have a way to do a samanvaya needs to be acknowledged. So you need to understand how a traditional guru or a traditional scholar understood all of these multiplicities and diversities, and how did they perform the samanvaya over centuries. It is through that that you understand how to understand all of these multiplicities, and not by doing this kind of a Western method or a linguistics based method and that kind of various new forms of looking at our epics, and to say that with every other disagreement, to say that this is a prakshipt or this is a later day addition, so on. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj, in fact, refers to some dates that Camil Bulcke has put to say that this is the particular date when Valmiki Ramayana has come up, or this is the particular date when the avatar of Vishnu was ascribed to Rama. And Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that even if you don't get into serious scholarship, right? If you just look at the fact that the idea of Rama, or the idea of the Vishnu avatar of Rama continues all through various works, that itself is an indication that a lot of the dating that Camil Bulcke has attempted to do is wrong. So he refers to Mahabharata. So the story in Mahabharata of the interaction between Bhima and Hanuman is quite well known. And of course, who can forget the fact that the Arjunas in the battle of Kurukshetra, if you look at the Kapidwaja, which was staying on Arjuna's chariot. So that itself is a reference to the persistence of Hanuman, of Ramayana, all through our epics. So he also talks about the pata or commentary of Vishnu Sahasranama done by somebody like Charaka. So he refers to the various references to Rama and Sita in the works of the playwright Bhasa through his works like the Pratima Nataka, Yagnaphalam, Abhishek Nataka, so on. And he refers to Adi Shankaracharya's own commentary on the Bhashya of Vishnu Sahasranama, where again he writes a lot about various nama or various meanings of Rama in the context of Vishnu Sahasranama. So, in light of all this, Karpatri-ji says that how can Bulcke even attempt to put a date of Rama being an avatar of Vishnu when there is so much more that has happened before that date through all these traditional sources that we have. In fact, there is also this very familiar trope, particularly famous in the Dravidian political discourse, where they say that Rama came to spread the Arya Sabhyata into South India. Now this is such a popular trope. So again here, Karpatri-ji deals with a lot of these at length, particularly in the context of the Aryan invasion theory that was quite popular in that era, and of course popular in some pockets even now, despite various rebuttals given to that by various scholars. So Karpatri-ji here says that as per the traditional discourse, our own origin stories are tied up to this land. So we say that the Vishwaki Srushti has happened in Bharat. Now, this idea that everybody is a migrant and Indian Hindus or the Aryan Hindus, they came from elsewhere, doesn't agree with the pramanas of the Vedas, of the Shastras, and of the Itihasas. So, Karpatri-ji is very assertive and categoric about this, that our own pramanas don't agree with this view that we came from outside. Now, of course, our schools and popular science, they teach something else. They say that we're all from Africa, for example. Needless to say, I mean, credit to them in that sense that they continue to come up with new proposals, disproving some of their earlier proposals. But we have our own sense of pramanas on traditional matters like these. So the challenge for us for our times is to, of course, how to reconcile with our own pramanas versus what is being forced upon us. Perhaps both can coexist, perhaps both can be separated. These are perhaps larger questions for us to introspect. Now, Karpatri-ji also talks about when he's talking about the Western view on Ramayana, he also talks about how the Westerners saw the Vanaras and Rakshasas as tribals or uncivilized brutes. So they saw that in collaboration with a lot of other such Indologist literature that has emerged prior to this. Even somebody like Bulcke says that Vanaras and Rakshasas that are seen in Ramayana are a part of that narrative of Aryan Hindus coming from top, trying to civilize people in the south, so on. So Karpatri-ji says that it is insane to talk about such things when the story of Ramayana itself is clear about why this happened. So when you have this story which says that Ravana got a boon that he cannot be vanquished by Devas and Devatas, that is why Vishnu had to take the avatar of a human, of an Nara, and that is why various devatas had to take these forms of vanaras and jambavan, etc. So when you have these stories, when you have the story of how the Hanuman's avatar actually has happened, and how Vali and Sugriva themselves are forms of divinities or avatars of Indra, Surya, etc. When you have all of this, how does it even make sense to say that they were tribes or they were uncivilized brutes, so on, as the Western scholarship has done? So Karpatri-ji, in this context, also says that a lot of trouble that people have in uh, understanding a lot of these narratives is that they try to look at this from a rational or logical lens, and they feel these are alaukik or avishwasni, which means they say these are supernatural. They don't sound very rational. They don't sound very believable in that context, and hence untrustworthy. So, in this context, Karpatri-ji Maharaj draws a reference to Adi Shankaracharya's Brahmasutra Bhashya, where he refers to a particular line from the Brahma Sutra Bhashya, which says, Tasmat Samulam Itihasa Puranam, which in the commentary, it really means that you need to the events described in the Vedic Itihasas and Puranas, they need to be respected in their own terms, and they have a factual basis. And hence, though the evidence from our own Itihasas and Puranas should not be dismissed. So now this kind of a look on our own Itihasas and Puranas and their justification of the alaukic and the supernatural elements is something that the Western scholarship doesn't acknowledge. One of the fundamental problems there being that they look at it purely from a historical lens, and they don't acknowledge the idea of Ishvara and Avatar that kind of pervades through all of these works. Now, it is in this context that Karpatri-ji also gives a very long defense of what he calls the Itihasikata of Rama, loosely translated as the historicity of Rama. And it's very interesting that his defense is really not in the terms that are going on today to say that, oh, if you say Ramayana is 3000 BC, I'll say it is 5000 BC or 6000 BC, so on. It is around a much, much larger context on what it means, what Rama means to the country, and what Aitihasikata means in the context of all of our epics, Puranas, and Vedas. So Karpatri-ji here says that Rama is is intricately tied to our life events, right from your birth, the Janma, and then wedding, and even your cremation. And he draws a reference to this chant of Ram Nam Satya Hai, which people do during your Antim Yatra, to say that the idea of Rama actually stays throughout, right from the end to death of the lifetime of several individuals in this country. And if you look at our Tirtha Yatras, people go to various kshetras that are connected to the epic on Ramayana, and there are various temples dedicated to Rama spread across the country in various corners. So, despite this kind of a prevalence of practice of a Loka Parampara, the fact that we are still doubting the claims on the historicity of Rama is laughable, is what Karpatri-ji Maharaj says. And he also makes this remark that. A lot of us today are really enamored by a lot of technological innovations that have happened in the West in the name of science and technology. And we are also disconnected from our own Vedas, Shastras, Darshanas, Tarka Shastras, so on. We don't study them. So there is a problem of what he calls is the anabhyas, which is we don't do the abhyas or the study that is required to engage with these. And hence, a lot of us are under this twin influence that we don't know our own traditional sources enough, and we are also enamored by the West. And it is in this lens that we consume a lot of these content that is thrown at us. And it is in this context that he says that we have become an Atma Gnan Shun Desh, which is really that a country which doesn't know itself that well. And it is interesting to talk about this in the context of a lot of chatter these days on decolonization and decoloniality. So it is important to look back at what our own traditional Dharmagurus have said in terms of what it means to understand our own self. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj here definitely is emphasizing the fact that knowing your Vedas, Shastras, Darshanas, Tarka Shastras, so on, are very important in trying to understand what it means to be a Bharateeya. So here, Karpatri-ji Maharaj also refers to a lot of the paramparas that are prevalent around history, around Ramayana, so on. So he says that you have a Loka parampara and you have a scholarly parampara as well. You have textual traditions, you have oral traditions, you have commentators. Despite having all these, why are we still doubting ourselves in matters, in very fundamental matters, such as the Itihasikta of Rama, for example? So he tries to draw strength from a lot of these live or sajiva avichinna paramparas. So I think it is in this context that it is important to understand a lot of the intentions of a lot of these Western scholars really is for us to lose faith on our own sources and our own pramanas, and for these paramparas to break. That is really the motive of a bunch of these scholars who somebody like Max Muller, let's say, was very open about these in some of his letters as well. So if you look at in detail at some of these allegations that Camil Bulcke has done in his book, as I mentioned, as I briefly touched upon earlier, he talks about this idea of Adi Ramayana that has been created by accumulating content from various oral traditions that predate Valmiki. And Karpatri-ji refutes a lot of these allegations in this book. So this idea that the Adi Ramayana is something different, Valmiki Ramayana is something different, and the original Ramayana is something else, which existed in terms of all of these oral traditions, is incorrect. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that Karpatri-ji continues to emphasize here that Bulcke's thesis here that Rama is not an avatar. He says that. That's incorrect. And Rama, the avatar bhavana is not just a bhavana, and he says that it is a praman siddh vastu sthiti, which means that it is something that can be proven with pramanas, and hence it is something that stands the test of pramanas, and hence it is real. So something that Bulke really attempts in his book is to also take a lot of stray references from Jain Ramayana, from Buddhist Ramayana, and from various other such renditions. And he tries to say that you know what, the Jains said this about Rama, this about Sita, and this about Dasharatha. The Buddhist rendition said so and so. In fact, not just Bulke, a lot of other scholars have also done this, which is to try to show these multiplicities and multiple renditions, and to say that perhaps there is no one version after all, perhaps everything goes. So this is fundamentally something that Karpatri-ji tries to refute in this book, and gives solid evidence against some of these aspersions. So Bulke's effort in a lot of this his work is really focused on trying to date what Karpatri-ji Maharaj calls as the Ram Bhakti ki Utpatti, which is to say that the devotional aspect of Rama has come out much later, and he was originally not a god, or he was originally not worshipped. So what Bulke essentially tries to do is to do various such logical distortions and proposals to arrive at a date of putting Ramayana somewhere in the like second to third century BC, which is very different from our own hoary antiquities of traditional timelines. So, in fact, Karpatri-ji questions Bulke in this work because Bulke himself says that he respects Tulsidas a lot, Tulsidas of Ramcharitmanas. So Karpatri-ji says that if you indeed respect Tulsidas, then how come you are denying the fact that Tulsidas saw Parabrahma in Rama? So he says that the fact that they are selectively picking and choosing from what they like itself shows that the intent of these Western scholars is really something else. So very cleverly, Bulke in fact does credit Valmiki Ramayana for the spread and popularity of Ramakatha and its influence on various versions of Ramayana. However, Karpatri-ji again here cautions that whenever you see Western scholars praise on such topics, you need to take it with a pinch of salt and a lot of caution. So Karpatri-ji says that such praise will be well received only if Bulke, let's say, had aligned with a lot of traditional commentators or tikakars of Ramayana in our own Bharati parampara. But he doesn't seem to align with it. He doesn't seem to align with the traditional view which saw perfect synthesis between the Nar Rupata and Narayan Rupata of Rama, which is to see both the human and the god in him together. So Karpatri-ji says that Bulke doesn't seem to get it or doesn't want to acknowledge this, and it is here that he compares Bulke's work to that of Max Muller, who has also done something like this. He does sing paeans to Indian classics in some places, and then discloses his own missionary agenda elsewhere in his works, particularly in some of his letters. So Karpatri-ji here suggests that there is indeed a multiplicity of renditions of Ramayana, and he says that you may find some contradictions occasionally between one version of Ramayana and another. But then the Sampradayik Sahitya, which is the traditional scholarship or traditional literature, has indeed figured out a way of finding a Samanvaya here of these multiplicities. And one of the ways of finding these Samanvaya is to also try to explain some of these differences by this idea of a kalpa beda, which is the differences through various kalpas. So the traditional perspective on this is to really say that across various kalpas, there are crores and crores of Ramavatars that have happened. So there are many Ramavatars across various kalpas, and it is through that lens that some of these differences are rationalized by saying that it is perhaps because of a kalpa bed by some of the traditional scholars. And it is here that Karpatri-ji Maharaj also says that somebody like Bulke doesn't acknowledge that Rama is a form of Ishvara, and he doesn't say that Ishvara can have avatars. So, because Bulke doesn't acknowledge Rama as an avatar of Ishvara, or because he doesn't consider Rama as Ishvara in the first place, he cannot come into this traditional mold of attributing a Kalpa Beda for some of these minor deviations that one sees across Ramayanas. So, in fact, if you look at our own traditional Puranas, as Karpatri-ji cites in this book of Matsya Purana and other renditions of Ramayana, like the Adbhut Ramayana, Anand Ramayana, or Puranas like Padma Puran, they talk about this much larger version of Ramayana called Shatakoti Pravistar Ramayana. And they say that a lot of these multiple versions of Ramayana that have come over time were perhaps things that have been derived from this Shatakoti Pravistar Ramayana. And the Valmiki Ramayana, which is currently in vogue, of the 24,000 shlokas, is a Sara of this or a something that has come out from the same Shatakoti Pravistar Ramayana. And this is the traditional perspective on doing Samanvaya of some of these multiple renditions, is what Karpatri-ji Maharaj says in this book. And he says that somebody like Bulke will reject all these methods. He doesn't acknowledge all these concepts or these ideas. So somebody like Bulke, for example, rejects the Brahmarupta of Rama, or the Vishnu Rupta of Rama, or the Lakshmi Rupata of Sita, the Divyatva of Hanuman, all of this is dismissed as prakshipt or later day additions or evolutionary corrections, that as the story kept evolving over generations, they kept getting added into it. This is the line that somebody like Bulcke takes, and the scholars like him also try to refer to these multiple versions of Ramayana to say that, hey, do you know that in some Ramayana, Sita was the daughter of Dasharatha, somewhere she was the daughter of Ravana, somewhere else she's called an Ayonija. There is the story of Vedavati, and then they try to confuse people with various such versions to bring this aspect of a self-doubt of perhaps there is like all of this is fiction after all, kind of a feeling into the readers. Now, Bulke also, for example, objects to the origin story of Hanuman as a later day addition. And one of his objections is also because of the fact that Hanuman elsewhere is told as a avatar of Shiva, and then in Ramayana, he's also told as an avatar, as a Vaiputra. So some of these are objections by Bulke, and Karpatri-ji refutes all of this to say that all of this is really happening because of a fundamental disconnect between how traditional discourse sees avatars and sees devatas, so on. So he says that there is nothing wrong with treating Hanuman, Lord Hanuman, as an Amsha of Shiva, and at the same time also seeing him as an avatar of Vayu, or as a Vaiputra. And he draws analogies with the way how Lord Kartikeya or Subramanya is at the same time seen as Shiva Putra. And with anybody familiar with the origin story of Kartikeya, there is also a role to be played there by Agni Deva, and he's also seen as the son of Agni Deva there. So Karpatri-ji draws references like these to say that uh, Avataravaad needs to be understood in a certain way, and the whole conception of devatas and avatars need to be understood within that mold. If you dismiss all of these as alaukic or supernatural or later day additions, it is very difficult for anybody to even understand any of this. Now, here Karpatri-ji also acknowledged that a lot of our poets, of course, do indulge in elements of fantasy, metaphors, and hyperbole as a part of what he calls as the rasa abhivyakti, which is to evoke certain rasas or emotions in the listeners. So there is indeed some creative liberty, and there's no denying that. But the basis of these renditions continues to be the Vedas, Itihasas, and Puranas. So the Kalpabeda Siddhanta that was referred to earlier cannot be understood by those who don't believe in the idea of Punarjanma. But a lot of Astika Bharatiyas who don't have problems accepting Punarjanma also don't have problems accepting these apparent diversities here and there in some of our renditions on Ramayana. Now, here Karpatri-ji Maharaj also gives a detailed treatment on this idea of alaukikata by saying that some of these scholars also dismiss this idea that the Samudra Langan of Hanuman, where he kind of traveled through the oceans in the skies, or the fact that he went to Himalayas to get the Sanjeevan Parvat, all of these are dismissed by a lot of these scholars because they don't sound rational. They are dismissed as creative liberty, or dismissed as supernatural elements, so on. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that this is happening only because you don't have a pramana bhava on Vedas and Itihasas and Puranas, and because you don't believe in Ishwar ki Shakti, and also in the power of Ishwara to manifest into various avatars. It is only those people who don't, who have a problem acknowledging that there is Vishnu in Rama and there is a Parabrahma in Rama. It is these people who cannot understand these, and it is these people who consider all of these as fictitious additions or supernatural elements, or historic references in our own epics. And in fact, Bulke also says this, that only because of Krishna or Krishna avatar and Krishna bhakti that Rama avatar and Rama bhakti came up. So Bulke makes these proposals that it is only inspired by this whole Krishna Bhakti that Rama Bhakti was later put into Ramayana. And he says that the Bal Leela of Rama is inspired by the Bal Leela of Krishna. And Karpatri-ji does a very good takedown of a lot of these accusations in this book. And in fact, in one part of the book where he is talking about these theories on Camil Bulke's aspersions on the influence of Krishna on Rama, he as a light-hearted reference, Karpatri-ji also says that even, let's say, if Krishna had indeed influenced Rama, the way to look at it from a Sanatan or a traditional perspective is to say that there was a Krishna before every Rama and there was a Rama before every Krishna, because it is all Anadi. So if you look at the avatar cycles and the Yuga cycles, of course there is a Dwapar Yuga before every Treta Yuga, and there is a Treta Yuga before every Dwapar Yuga. So you can always say that there was also a Krishna before every Rama. And it is in this context that Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that even if those influences were to be true, there is indeed a way to do a samanvaya based on the Avataravaad, which is prevalent within the traditional discourse. So Karpatri-ji also asserts time and again through the book that somebody like Bulcke needs to understand that he isn't reading Christian works, and Indian works are indeed rife with references to Punarjanma. So nobody will really have objections to understanding that both Rama and Krishna are avatars of Vishnu, that both Sita and Rukmini are avatars of Lakshmi, and this is all within the scope of the Punarjanma Parampara discourse. So it is a lot of Astika Hindus or believer Hindus, they don't have a problem embracing all of this. So if anybody has a pramana bhava on Valmiki Ramayana, Mahabharata, Bhagavatam, Garga Samhita, so on, Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that a lot of these questions on the astitva of Rama and Krishna can be easily answered. It is only because you are trying to reject all those pramanas and then trying to analyze all these through other methods is why all of these confusions are showing up. In fact, in the book, Bulcke, in his book, Bulcke also says that this idea that the brothers of Rama, Lakshmana, Shatrugna, and Bharata, they are also in the traditional discourse treated as avatars of Shesha, which is the Vishnu serpent, and you have Shankha, which is the conch shell, and Sudarshana, which is the Sudarshan Chakra of Vishnu. So all of Lakshmana, Shatrugna, and Bharata are indeed attributed as avatars of all this in the traditional discourse. And Bulke says that these are all later day addition, and he says that there is no evidence that Sita is Lakshmi's avatar, and these are all later day additions. So it is in this context that, again talking about pramanas, that Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that somebody like Bulke says that all of the Puranas are also Kalpanas, they're also fiction. He says that all Puranas were created post-Christ. As I mentioned early on in the talk, a lot of scholars even today try to put it post-Gupta era and closer to 15th century, 16th century, so on. So even if there are references to the avatar aspects of Sita and Rama in the Puranas, if there are references to or the Parabrahma aspect or the Mool Prakriti aspect of Sita and Rama in the Puranas, a lot of these missionary scholars or Christian scholars, they won't accept any of these. And the traditional discourse of seeing a lot of these Puranas as some things that Vyasa has created is also not something that a lot of these scholars acknowledge or endorse. So the fact that the traditional discourse has different pramanas and different pramana bhava on even our Puranas, and they do see a samanvaya, is something that a lot of these scholars don't endorse. Now, again, Bulke time and again emphasizes in the book that this Lokapriyata of Ramakatha, he says that Rama Katha is very popular in the country, and he says it's a great story which a lot of people through generations have connected to. But in the very next moment, he denies the authenticity of Avataravaad and Bhakti Baba. So it is here that Karpatri-ji Maharaj very categorically states that the reason why Ramayana is popular, the reason why the stories of Krishna is popular, is not because of Vagvilas or because of the Kantashoshan aspects, which is just because there is some kind of a wordplay, or just because it is good to hear. It's not because of that these epics are popular. Of course, not denying those elements in the epics, but what Karpatri-ji Maharaj emphasizes is they are popular also because they are seen of as sources of Anupam Shanti, which is peace, long-lasting peace, and of Bhakti, which is devotion, Tata Mukti, which is moksha. So it is because of these aspects of Shanti, Bhakti, and Mukti that Ramayana is popular, and Ramayana continues to stay popular even, let's say, in the future, and not necessarily just because it's a good story to listen to. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj, all through the book, takes down some of Bulcke's allegations on the same lines, where Bulcke tries to disconnect Ramayana with Vedas by saying that there are stray references to Ikshvaku, Dasarada, Rama, and Sita's in Vedas here and there. But Bulcke says that, but this the Vedic Rama doesn't seem to be the Vedic. The Vedic Rama doesn't seem to be the same Rama as in Ramayana, or the Vedic Sita doesn't seem to be as the same Sita in Ramayana. Same with Dasharada, and he says something similar on Janaka as well. So it is here again that. Karpatri-ji cites a lot of traditional sources from the Upanishads and gives various interpretations to the same lines that Bulcke quotes to say how Bulcke's interpretation is wrong. And it is in this context that Karpatri-ji Maharaj also continues to again re-emphasize this fact that the Vedas are Anadi, Apaurshaya, and Swata Pramana, and it is not correct to separate mantras, Brahmanas, Aranyakas, and Upanishads into various different parts and ascribe various different timelines to it, as a lot of these Western scholars do, only to deny any reference to give from you give from a certain Upanishad to justify your stance. They come back to say that, oh, but that Upanishad is a later day addition. It was in this BC. This Veda is the early Veda. So it is pretty much like they want to see justification for everything within Rig Veda. And even if you find something, it is their interpretation that they talk of and not the traditional interpretation. So Karpatriji here refutes a lot of these allegations through the book. He emphasizes that their methods are wrong. He says that their obsession with chronology is incorrect. And he says that in matters of dharma, in matters of understanding what is dharma, what is Brahma, what is Parabrahma, the Veda, the Shastras is the Praman, and it is not Pratyaksha Praman and it is not Anuman Praman. So he also takes down some of Bulke's allegations that this Devatas or Devas were later day additions. So Karpatri-ji, in fact, has a very long section in the book. In fact, he has also written this in some of his other books as well. On do you want to consider Devatas as fictitious entities? If yes, why? If no, why? And he gives a long justification for why this whole conception that Devata or Daiva Bhavana is a later day addition is a very stupid idea to begin with. And he also dismisses a lot of these ideas that it was just nature worship which later evolved into devas and devatas. So here, Karpatriji also talks about some of these distortions from the Indologists, where funnily some of them say that the Mahabharata happened before Ramayana, because in Mahabharata there is much more of the persistence of something like polygamy. They say that, oh, if you look at Kunti seems to have multiple relationships, Draupadi also seems to have multiple relationships. That feels very primitive. But if you look at Ramayana, there is Ekapatni Vrata, so which is monogamy, so that seems more evolved. So there are some Indologists and some Western scholars who say that Mahabharata was more tribal and primitive, and Ramayana is more evolved. So Karpatriji takes down a lot of these arguments, and he ridicules some of these propositions here. So it is here that he says that a new method of looking at our own traditional sources is really just to pick a book and interpret them as the mind pleases through linguistic techniques, or just purely based on language to say that I'll flip pages of Ramayana and then I'll figure out. So he says that this is not how things used to happen before, that all traditional interpretations were through Guru Paramparas or through Loka Paramparas, and the Parampara was the guardian of the Pramana or the Pramanic way of looking at this. And it is here that Karpatriji Maharaj also refers to a lot of traditional tikakars. There is a Nagesha Bhatta's tikas, which is popular, which is the Ramabirami tika. There is a Bhushan tika, Tirtha tika, Katak tika. There's a lot of tikas which are quite popular in the traditional discourse. So Karpatriji Maharaj says that it is not just the parampara of the tikakars. You also had a parampara of the upasakas, which are people, the sadhakas and the upasakas, who have imbibed the Daiva Bhavana of Rama through their upasanas. When you have all these paramparas, why do you have to abandon your commentators? Why do you have to abandon your upasakas' ways of looking at Rama, and then go by the Western Indologist or historical method of looking at our own epics? So he has a section in the book which. Is categorically titled as Paschatyonka Rog, which is like a disease of the Western gaze. So In this section, he also is very categorical in stating that a lot of the Indologists and missionaries of that era, they could not acknowledge or could not digest the fact that a civilized society could have existed before Christ, and that is why they try to do a lot of these distortions around chronologies and timelines. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj says that a lot of the timelines exist in our own literature. A lot of timelines on Ramayana exist in Valmiki Ramayana itself. Then why should we really be running around? Now, another very interesting part in this book is also a very detailed explanation of various Ramayanas, like the Buddhist Ramayana, the Chinese Ramayana, the Tibetan Ramayana, and you have some of these versions of Ramayana in the Buddhist Ramayana where they say that Rama and Sita were sisters. Sita was sister of Rama, and they support the marriage of the brother and sister. So Karpatri-ji says that a lot of these Ramayanas, they don't have a sense of pramana for Vedas or Shastras, and he says that there is a way to understand what is right and what is wrong. So he repeatedly emphasizes that we should not get lost in these multiplicities and diversities and then abandon the epic or the links to the epic altogether. And it is in this context that I can also recollect my own personal story here, that I remember when the A.K. Ramanujan's 300 Ramayana, there was a controversy around that. It was at that time that a friend of mine told me that if you have so many Ramayanas, what Ramayana should I really tell my daughter? What Ramayana should I really believe in? And it is in this context that I look at Karpatri-ji's understanding or analysis on all of these multiplicities of Ramayanas in this book. And in fact, in this book, he also gives a very detailed takedown of one particular book by somebody called Badant Anand Kaushalyan. That book is called Ram Ki Kahani, Ram Ki Jubani. So Kaushalyan was influenced by the Buddhist scholar and social reformer Rahul Sankratyayan and B.R. Ambedkar. So he wrote his own version called Ram Ki Kahani, Ram Ki Zubani, which is it's not a version of Ramayana, but it can be treated as a Ramakatha or a perspective of Rama from Kausalyan's eyes. So Karpatri-ji gives a very detailed takedown in this book. It is just astonishing to imagine what would have gone behind the scenes for this kind of a scholarly Poorvapaksha, because Karpatri-ji Maharaj, in one side, is reading all these books. On one side, he's quoting so many traditional sources. In fact, in the book, he gives references not just to the Buddhist and Buddhist Ramayana, Jain Ramayana, so on. He talks about Tamil Ramayana, he talks about Telugu Ramayanas, Malayalam Ramayanas, Nepali, Simhali, tribal Kashmiri Ramayanas, Assami Ramayanas, Marathi Ramayanas. I can just go on. So he talks about all of this. Let's say up to 50, 60 different versions of Ramayanas and books on Ramayana. And through this, he also cites, let's say, 50 to 100 primary sources through various Puranas, Samhitas, epics, Vedas, so on. So it is just stunning to see this kind of scholarship from around Dharmagurus. And it really gives us a way for us to understand how to understand a lot of these narrative politics that are underway today on these topics. In fact, a lot of what Karpatri-ji takes down in these particular sections on the Buddhist and Jain Ramayanas are quite relevant for our own times today, because you do see such things getting circulated on social media or even in academic journals to this day. So Karpatri-ji here also talks about one particular Jain version of Ramayana, which is quite popular. This is something called Paumachariya, which is written by Vimala Suri, a Jain monk. And here he says that it is incorrect to treat the Jain Ramayana as a source when the apparent contradictions between the Jain view and the Vedic views are well known. To dismiss Valmiki Ramayana based on a Jain Ramayana, as Camil Bulcke does in his book, is ridiculous, Karpatri-ji states in this book. Now, Karpatri-ji here also talks about the fact that given these diversities, now there is one way, of course, to say that Rama was just fiction, Krishna was just fiction, and hence, because it is fiction, anything goes. Anybody can write whatever they want. But if you take that approach, it doesn't really explain why there are so many bhaktas, so many aradhakas to Rama to this day. Why do so many people do bhajans of Rama to this day? Because it is not just fiction. Rama was indeed an avatar, and there is a certain version of Rama which was indeed considered as pramanic by this country for so long. And and it is that pramana discussion that Karpatri-ji tries to orchestrate in this particular section on the book when he's dealing with these diversities and multiplicities of Ramayanas. And he, of course, cautions that even in his times, which is of course true for our times as well, there are a bunch of people who say that Rama and Krishna did not exist. So for them, of course, anything goes. So but if you look at the way the traditional commentary is around a lot of these multiplicities of Ramayanas, what they are really trying to do some kind of a gatekeeping, that whatever version of Ramayana that you are writing, so there is a mool Ramayana conception that is there, and your kalpanas should not be in running in total contradiction to that mool Ramayana. And you have this Siddhantas or Adarshas for which Ramayana stands for. So whatever Kalpana you are doing should not be Siddhant evam Adarsh Virudh, as Karpatri-ji states, which is it should not run contrary to the fundamental principles and ideals of Ramayana means to the people. So it is here that Karpatri-ji also gives a reference to this idea of ekam sat viprabhuda vadanti, which multiple scholars have used and multiple philosophers have used in multiple places to explain the fact that there is there are these multiplicities which are all trying to describe the same one integral whole. So Karpatri-ji says that be that as it may, while that might exist, that cannot just be used to float around this idea that anything goes and everything is God. So he does again emphasize this fact that there is indeed some principles and some ideals that Ramakatha is supposed to stand for, and there is indeed some sense of a pramana bhava and some sense of gatekeeping even in the traditional discourse. So, of course, he says that a poet can take creative liberty. There is this whole notion of an alankara, and there is this whole notion of a metaphoric description when it comes to creation of stories, of creating your own version of Ramayana. And Karpatri-ji Maharaj doesn't dismiss that. He is not saying that there is one hard-bound print copy of Valmiki Ramayana like a Bible, and that is what should stay. That is not something that Karpatri-ji Maharaj says in this book. In fact, all through the book, he himself quotes from so many versions of Ramayanas, including the most recent work of Ramcharitmanas from Tulsidas, and also various other predating traditional versions like the Anand Ramayana, Adbhut Ramayana, so on. So Karpatri-ji Maharaj nowhere is trying to propagate an ossified, hardbound print copy version of Valmiki Ramayana. And it is in this context that I can recollect something I have read in my own reading of the Telugu scholar and author Vishwanatha Satyanarayana's Srimad Ramayana Kalpavruksham, for which he got the Jnanpith award as well. So if you look at some of the passages of Ramayana that Vishwanatha Satyanarayana himself has come up with as a part of Ramayana Kalpavruksham, he uses metaphorical descriptions and idioms that are suited to the Telugu country. Now, this kind of a creative liberty is something that nobody really objects to, because that is well within the bounds of not disrespecting the principles and ideals of Ramayana. So, I think when Karpatri-ji Maharaj is trying to talk about a multiplicity of Ramayanas, he's really trying to say that there are indeed some kind of creative liberties that are good and some kind of creative liberties that are bad. So it is in that context that I also look at the works of somebody like Vishwanatha Satyanarayana in the 20th century on Ramayana Kalpavruksham. So we indeed do have traditional versions of Ramayana that have come up even let's say in the past 100 years. Now all of these is again just to re-emphasize the fact that a trope that is taken by a lot of critics these days is to say that the moment you bring the traditional discourse into play, they try to say that, oh, you are being anti-diversity, you are trying to ossify, you are trying to semitize religion, so on. So it is very interesting to see this kind of an acknowledgement from somebody like Swami Karpatri-ji of how to understand these diverse narratives of Ramayana, and how to understand what is a good Ramayana, what is a bad Ramayana, what is Satya, what is Mithya, and the Pramana Bhava, so on Ramayanas. And in this section, one of the books that Karpatri-ji also gives a very strong rebuttal to is also this book called Agni Pariksha, which is written by somebody called Acharya Sri Tulsi, who was a head of a Terapanthi Shwetambar Jain sect. In fact, at that time, there was also a legal tussle, a court case on this version of the Jain Ramayana. So there are these aspersions put in that book that Rama had multiple wives, or he indulged in romantic relationships with multiple women. So Karpatri-ji says that it is very clear when one reads this kind of Ramayanas that the authors lack Shraddha and Bhakti for Rama and Sita. So, if I were to summarize one line on Karpatri-ji Maharaj's take on the multiplicities of Ramayanas, perhaps this is a good example. So, just in the name of creative liberty, if you are going to talk of things like this, that Rama had multiple wives or he indulged in romantic relationships with multiple people, it clearly reflects your own lack of Shraddha and Bhakti. So, as long as the author of that particular version of Ramayana has Shraddha and Bhakti towards Rama and Sita, I don't think any traditional scholar or Dharmaguru is going to reject that particular version of Ramayana. So, it is really about the aspects of Shraddha and the aspects of Bhakti and the aspects of these principles and ideals, that what Ramayana means. That it is based on these that you need to judge these versions of Ramayana. So there is also a long treatise in this book on each individual kanda of Ramayana. So, for example, Karpatri-ji takes the Balakanda and then explains these are Bulcke's objections on Balakanda, and these are my rebuttals. So he takes Ayodhya Kanda, Yuddha Kanda, Aranya Kanda, various instances. Like there is a section on Agni Parisha, there is a section on Sita's Janma Vrittant, and there is a section on Uttarakanda, on the story of Lavakusha, on the Pramanikata of Uttarakanda, whether Uttarakanda should be considered as a later day addition or not, as Bulcke asserts. So Karpatri-ji gives a very, very detailed analysis on all of these. So he takes every single instance in every single of those kandas to explain why the traditional scholarship is correct and why Bulcke is wrong. And he continues to emphasize that Ramayana needs to be seen, the Valmiki Ramayana needs to seen as a continuum from the Balakanda to the Uttarakanda. So, as a conclusion, I would say that this book is really like close to 1,000 pages. It is an exceptionally dense book, and a lot of it is also for serious scholars. So, perhaps somebody like me is also not qualified to give a very comprehensive review of this book, because it needs somebody who is really deeply wedded into that kind of a scholarship on Vedas, Puranas, and Itihasas, so on. Of course, it is not to say that somebody like me or somebody like some of you listening to this talk should not read the book. There is, of course, a lot that we can gather, and which will also inspire us in our own personal journeys. But it's an exceptionally dense book, and I'm just cautioning that this talk should not be considered as a summum bonum, or like a be all and end all of this particular book. There's, of course, a lot more to be understood from Swami Karpatri-ji's analysis on Ramayana. So this talk is really just a humble tribute to the genius of the great Dharmagurus of this land. So of course, in our times today on the social media, you see there's a lot of criticism or abuse of Dharmagurus also that happens based on a snippet here, based on a snippet there. It is quite unfortunate. And if you look at the kind of scholarship that is there in this book on Ramayana Mimamsa, I really don't know if anybody reads through this book from page 1 to page 900, let's say, there is only reverence, respect, and worship that somebody would have to the Dharmaguru tradition of this land and to the genius of Swami Karpatri-ji. So we are the 21st century inheritors of this Bharateeya parampara, and I think we need to embrace our own traditions better, so that we can understand these narrative distortions that are at play in our own times. And we need to argue based on our own methods and our own pramanas and our own terms, and not on the Westerners. So that is one of the most important lessons that Karpatri-ji is giving to us as readers when we read this book on Rama and Mimansa, that you need to use your own methods, your own pramanas, and your own terms, and don't fall for the Indological method or the Western method, as that is deficient and that is not help you understand the whole of the Veda Shastra Parampara that we have on this land. So through this talk, I have done a brief attempt to refer to some of these methods of Westerners, primarily through the work of Camil Bulcke, as referred to by Swami Karpatri-ji. And I've tried to explain the interpretations of these Westerners of our epics. And using Swami Karpatri-ji's arguments, I've tried to also exhibit the flaws and deficiencies of such an understanding. Again, I would like to re-emphasize the fact that there is enough of traditional scholarship available, and it is up to us to embrace all of that. It is up to us to look up to our own Dharmagurus for inspiration and for understanding on a lot of these matters. And we cannot deny the centrality of Avataravaad, of Bhakti, of Mukti, and of Daiva Bhavana when we are looking at our own epics. We should not fall prey for this kind of a historic, historic method, or a secular method of looking at what is really are our sacred traditional sources. It is an opportunity from my side to give a tribute to our own Dharmagurus, and I'd like to thank Atharva Forum for giving me this opportunity to talk about Ramayana Mimamsa on this particular video here. It is also unfortunate that a lot of discourse on some of the works of Karpatri-ji, like this one, doesn't exist in English, and this is a small attempt so that those who can really read Hindi will take to the originals and start their own personal journeys, taking inspiration from this brief introductory talk. Thanks, everyone.